Hi, welcome to week one of George Washington Leadership Lessons webinar series. I really appreciate everybody coming out and attending this meeting, and I look forward to the interaction that we're going to have together as we learn a little bit more about leadership and really look to close that gap between the ideal leader that we want to be and the leader that we are today. I know through our meetings that we're going to close that gap. We may just take one step. We may take 10 steps towards that ideal and towards the leader that we know that we can be. A couple of housekeeping items. One, if you come in and out of the webinar, you don't have to announce yourself when you come in and out. I only ask that when you have a comment to make, that you do say your name, make your comment. That way we can all get to know your voice and who you are and be able to respond back to you by your name. Now, why am I here? I've already hinted to an extent that we are all looking to close that gap, be a better leader tomorrow than we were today. And one of the ways we're going to do that is by listening to each other, by reading this material, by thinking about it, and most importantly, implementing some of these ideas and some of these lessons that we learned into our own leadership skill set. Now, why this book? I was in Virginia, up in Washington, D.C. area last summer, and I was looking for a book while I was at the Virginia Military Institute, a book on leadership that maybe the cadets were required to read. And although I was finding plenty of textbooks, that wasn't what I was looking for. I was looking for something, maybe a biography, maybe a book, almost like a John Maxwell book or a Brian Tracy book, or something similar that was on leadership. And my wife saw this book, brought it to my attention. I thumbed through it, and what struck me were the three distinct sections that were in this book. Now, we're only covering the first section in this webinar series, and that section is the 15 different leadership lessons that the author identified that George Washington had a particularly strong skill set with. The second section, you guys may have already read ahead and identified, were really the lessons and laws of civility that Washington sat down and wrote out for himself. And then the third section were the sections dealing with George Washington as an entrepreneur, George Washington as somebody who took his estate holdings and really maximized what he could do with them. He was always looking for a way to take his goods directly to the consumer, cut out the middleman, so to speak, and make sure that he maximized his return on his investment and his efforts, as well as bringing value to the consumer. Washington, as you may or may not have known, didn't grow tobacco. Instead, he focused on wheat, on oats, on goods that people and animals could consume, because he thought that that was really the strength of America, was going to be to feed the world. Washington introduced mules to the U.S. He introduced a number of different inventions, including a raised barn that he used to harvest grains. They would put the grains out on the floor, and horses would walk on these and separate the wheat from all the other material from the shaft and allow the grains to fall through where it was collected up. And all of this was underneath of a shelter so that he could run that granary and he could harvest and work on creating flour and creating corn grain, even if it was raining outside. So something a little bit remarkable that he had going on. Not just a politician, not just a leader in military service, but also a farmer and an entrepreneur. Now, how do we all win during these 4 weeks that we're spending together? We win by sharing ideas, by reading the book, by studying the material, by thinking about it, and like I said, most importantly, implementing some of the ideas that we have. There's no way that we're going to implement all of the ideas that are put forward in these books and in these webinars. But if you find a couple that really strike a chord with you emotionally, those are going to be the ones where you try a little bit harder. You move your skill set a little bit further along, and you develop your leadership skills a little bit more so that you can impact the people around you in your network, as well as those people at your business and those people that are on your teams, whether you're working in volunteer organizations, whether you're coaching Little League, whether you're a scoutmaster, running a fishing boat, whatever it might be. You take your leadership skills up a notch, it's going to make a big difference with you and those around you. So bear with me right now. I'm going to switch the screen here. I'm going to go to the PowerPoint presentation. I'll talk through that, and I'm going to turn off my video so that we're not, we're not distracted by, what's going on around me. So let's go here. Share that. And we'll hide the video panel. Very good. Now we've already gone over some of these housekeeping items, so I won't go over them again. Let's just go ahead and move into Chapter 1, A Leader Has Vision. It's absolutely critical that a leader has a vision. Without a vision, that leader is just wandering around. He's not focused, and he doesn't know where to necessarily take the people that are surrounding him. Now, the leaders will oftentimes look at the same ground, the same areas, the same set of circumstances that others look at, and they see something different. They see the potential that they have to build and develop something, to apply technology in a new and different way. And what they do when they see that is they become so excited that they want to drive forward and make that vision a reality. Oftentimes we see leaders, whether it's business, political, or wherever, that will take extraordinary risks. They will risk fortune, they will risk reputation, they will risk whatever it takes to see that their vision becomes a reality. And a leader anticipates the moves ahead. One thing that a leader and a good leader will do is they not only see where they want to go, they see and anticipate obstacles to reaching that vision. They'll see that there might be political resistance to it. And so they take steps to move around that resistance. They take steps to make sure that somehow they get to where they need to go. A lot of times it's almost like a leader will see that there's a city across a chasm or a canyon. They know they're going to get there, they don't know how, and then they know that they're going to need to build a bridge to make it there. And so they don't just stop because that bridge doesn't exist yet. They move forward and they anticipate needing to build that bridge. And so they start putting those materials, they start bringing a team, they start bringing what resources they need to make that happen so they can get across to the other side. And John Maxwell said, people don't follow a worthy cause, they follow worthy leaders who promote their worthy causes. And I believe that that's true. How many times have you been energized when somebody comes and talks to you about the way things could be, the way things they want them to be? Hey, I'm going to build a business that's going to redefine how we move letters and documents around in this country. People need to get legal documents. People need to get things, and they need to be overnight. And when that person gets excited about it, and I'm talking about the founder of FedEx here, other people get excited about it. They want to invest in it. They either invest their own money, they invest their skills, they invest themselves emotionally into that cause. And it may not even be a political cause, like I just was talking about. It may be a business cause. But people want to get excited, and they'll follow that leader and they'll follow that worthy cause because that leader has that vision. Now, how did Washington develop that vision, and how did he show vision? Washington knew that the country and the colonies were going to expand. So as Washington was looking for assets, was Washington looking to expand his own land holdings, he gained tracts of land in many different states, including Ohio. And he never went to Ohio, but he had some vast holdings that were in Ohio, Maryland, what became West Virginia, and other states, to the point where, you know, he had holdings in 7 different states, and some of those holdings he never saw. But he knew that the country was going to expand. He knew the country and the residents were going to push up over the Blue Ridge and the Shenandoah Mountains through the Cumberland and spill over into what would become Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, Indiana, Illinois, and what, you know, the start of the Midwest. He knew that the Americans were going to push out there. And so he wanted to have those land holdings to be able to take advantage of that, whether he sold off those holdings when people finally moved into those areas, or he developed his own farms. Either way, he was going to be where people were going to head towards. Canal building and opening up the Cumberland and Ohio regions. Washington knew that if he could get in and be a founder and be an investor into the canals that would open up trade routes, that would open up commerce in through the Cumberland and the Ohio regions, that would increase his wealth, that would increase his holdings, and it would allow him the flexibility to increase the, you know, adding on to the lands and staying out of debt. One of the interesting things is that Washington's vision for expanding his holdings and expanding what he did allowed him to stay out of debt. And he's one of the few founding fathers that died a relatively rich man, where others, such as Jefferson, died being in debt and building a capital city. You know, when Washington took over, the presidency was located in New York, and then it moved for a period of time to Philadelphia before settling in Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C. was picked out not because so much that it was a beautiful place to be, but because it was halfway between northern and southern states. It was a capital that no one region could share. The Southerners didn't like the idea of the presidency and the seat of government being located so far north in New York. And the Southerners certainly didn't want it coming, let's say, down to Georgia, too far south. But the D.C. area, that Virginia, Maryland area, was a good compromise. But Washington knew that we needed, as a young country, a capital that would, if you could pick it up and move it to Europe, would be as at home in Europe as it would be in this new young country. And so instead of staying with a small capital, he wanted something grand. He wanted something that had that European flavor to it. So when the United States had ambassadors, when the United States was holding and entertaining people from Europe and the old country, that they saw that this was a country of substance, that they saw that this was a country that wanted and could be an equal to them. And probably the biggest leadership lesson with vision was how Washington handled being president, the traditions that he set forth. He was very aware that everybody was going to watch him and everybody was going to see how he was going to react and what the traditions were that he was going to bring to that office. You know, there was a lot of discussions on what to call the president. Your Excellency, for example. Washington wanted something that would be respectful, but would be something that wouldn't be anywhere close to being what you would call a head of state of Europe, you know, a king or a queen. And instead of Your Excellency or Your Highness, settled in on Mr. President. A very respectful title, but a title that was obviously a move away from something like Your Excellency. Washington knew that he was setting the traditions for those that would follow him in the peaceful transition of government. He sat upon serving only 2 terms when he very well could have won a third term and maybe even more. But he figured that, 8 years was enough. Not only did he want to get home to his family and back to his farm and take care of his estates and be back where he loved to be, but he really wanted also to set the tone of, this presidency is not a job for life. As business owners, as leaders, we sometimes don't think about how we set the tone for our own teams and for those that are going to follow us. You may not be a leader of a growing business, you may be a leader of a team, but how you lead that team sets the tone and sets the precedence for those that come after you, especially when you're in a situation where people get promoted up from within and you may be grooming your own successor. That successor and those people on that team know what your traditions and know what your standards are. And so it's very important that we be aware of that when we're leading our networks, when we're leading our businesses, when we're leading our families even. So the next chapter, a leader is honest. Honesty is one of these things where it takes a lifetime to really cultivate and develop a reputation for being honest. But it's something that you can ruin very, very quickly, and it becomes very hard to get back. How far can you really go in business without being honest? There's all these examples of insider trading. There's examples of people that weren't honest in their dealings. But sooner or later, that all catches up with somebody. And it normally leads to either bankruptcy, ruin of reputation. It may result in the removal of being on the board of directors. It may be forced resignations, whatever it may be. Sooner or later, when that individual is not honest, it does catch up with them. I had 3 examples here: Brian Williams, John Kerry, and Richard Nixon. Brian Williams has just recently got in trouble and had to step down as head of NBC Network News. Well, not the head of the news, but he was the anchor. Because of his repeated, let's say, exaggeration of being attacked by RPGs when he was in Iraq and embedded with soldiers. He was in a flight of helicopters. One of the helicopters in that flight, not his, was attacked with RPGs and was forced down. But Brian Williams took to telling the story as if he was in that helicopter and he was forced down. Eventually, the military called him out on it, and he's just recently had to step down and take a leave of absence from NBC News. His credibility shot, NBC's credibility is shot and is tarnished. And although Brian Williams is probably a nice guy and will probably work again, it's going to take a long time for him to recover his reputation and for anybody not to be suspect of him. John Kerry, somebody that ran for president, about 8-10 years ago, you could almost say that he lost the presidency because of the exaggerations, and being nice here, the exaggerations of how much combat he saw in Vietnam. John Kerry was in something called swift boats, right? These are river-running patrol craft that are armed with machine guns and sometimes grenade launchers. Although he was in combat, he exaggerated the extent of the combat that he saw. And a number of other swift boat veterans came out against him and cast enough doubt in people's minds that it's credited with him losing the presidency to George Bush. Richard Nixon. Richard Nixon is probably the most famous president to have been disgraced ever. A number of presidents have had to step down or didn't run again or didn't win the presidency again because of scandal or because there were issues with the presidency. But Richard Nixon's the only president that had to step down because he was going to be removed from office due to his involvement in the Watergate scandal in 1972. all of these people had a loss of reputation. All of these people may or may not gain that back. For all the good that Nixon did in opening up China to U.S. trade and for helping to navigate China away from alliances with Russia and moving towards more open relationships with the United States, a very huge foreign policy achievement. He's always going to be remembered more for Watergate than he is for his foreign policy achievements. So let's see how Washington did with being honest and demonstrating honesty. Sometimes in Washington's life as a leader, whether it was with the militia during the French and Indian War, or whether it was as commander-in-chief of the colonial army during the Revolution, his honesty and his reputation for being honest was sometimes the only thing that got him more troops, more supplies, that allowed him to stay in command. Washington was not known as a great tactician. He wasn't somebody like a Rommel. He wasn't somebody like let's say a Lee or a Patton or a general that was known for outmaneuvering, for beating his opponents through greater skill. But he was known as being honest and determined, and for his leadership abilities in following through until he won. And so without that reputation of being honest, he could have been removed by his enemies politically almost any time during the long Revolutionary War. But his reputation, again, and I keep going back to this, is really what left him in charge and saw him through to the end of the revolution as commander-in-chief of the rebel forces. Washington was very consistent in his message and his deeds. As an example, in the book, we see where there were several times where traitors were caught and were handled and given a traitor's punishment, which at that time was hanging versus a firing squad. Firing squad was reserved for other offenses, but treason was dealt with as a hanging offense. Even when people were close to Washington, such as members of his own bodyguard, they were still treated as traitors versus given a different form, again, of maybe firing squad because he had a relationship with them. So his troops and the people around him knew that what he said and what he did were very consistent. And that trust and honesty is what opened those doors to opportunity. It's what allowed a young Washington to move up the ranks within Virginia society and to move up the ranks politically as well. His reputation for being honest and fair is what put him in charge of the Continental Conventions and put him in charge of all these different factions where people knew that they would maneuver, color stories, make statements, do different things to suit their own political agendas. Washington was honest and forthright enough that everybody at least trusted him to do the right thing and give the right message. So let's talk about Chapter 3, Ambition. This is a great chapter. There are so many different lessons and examples of ambition, both good and bad. I'm focusing on the good ones here, but some of the bad ones would be, let's say, Hitler's ambition for a united German Europe, or let's say, other leaders that would cast their regions and countries into conflict and war because they wanted more territory, they wanted the resources of other groups, they wanted, something else. That kind of ambition, I don't want to focus on too much, but it is there. The ambition examples that I have in this presentation are Jefferson with the Louisiana Purchase. Jefferson saw an opportunity to expand the country. Napoleon needed money for his battles in Europe and against the Brits, especially, And Jefferson knew that he could expand the country so that it was truly from Atlantic to Pacific, that we could have a land where we didn't have any former European colonial powers involved. You know, it's a wide open space that the colonies, the former colonies, the Americans, could make with it what they would. And we can debate, you know, how good or bad a job Jefferson and those that came after him did with Western expansion and what went on with all of that. But the fact that Jefferson took an opportunity, and some could even make an argue that he was violating the Constitution by going into treaties and making this purchase without Congress. But he knew in his heart, and he knew that vision that we talked about from chapter 1, that he had to go out there and make this purchase. Roosevelt and the Rough Riders in the Panama Canal, you know, here's this this young New York man who's out of Montana. The U.S. goes to war. He gets a bunch of his cowboy buddies. He out of his own pocket funds the Rough Riders, creates an irregular force, and they get involved in taking San Juan Hill and, you know, being part of the Spanish-American War. And then in his presidency, bringing the industrial might of the U.S. to bear on building out the Panama Canal. I mean, that's a huge, huge, ambitious project that's undertaken. One that, you know, several attempts by European powers failed, but the Americans persevered and the Americans made it happen. And it was through that level of ambition of you know, American might at that time, and pride in America and American know-how, and, you know, everything that was around that early 20th century, late 19th century belief system in the U.S. and what we were capable of. Kennedy, you know, he's given his man will set foot on the moon by the end of the decade speech in the early 60s, when we could barely get rockets off the launching pad without them blowing up. Many of you might have seen video clips of rockets that start to, you know, fire off their engines. They go up about 20 feet, maybe they go up higher, they spin out of control, or they just blow up on the launching pad. You know, here you are, it's failure after failure, and it's known failures. And then he's coming out and saying, oh, by the way, within the next 7 to 8 years, we're going to put somebody on the moon. You know, how ambitious is that kind of a vision, and how ambitious is that kind of a goal? And then we have some of these, you know, captains of industry, so to speak. Andrew Carnegie with steel manufacturing and even his involvement earlier in railroads. John D. Rockefeller with oil out of that Ohio area that we were talking about, around Cleveland and around, you know, that whole area. J.P. Morgan with the banking and finance. And then when we jump forward into the later half of the 20th century, you know, Steve Jobs with Apple and Pixar, and Elon Musk, and, you know, this could go on and on and on. You have Richard Branson, you have Bill Gates, you have, you know, so many different people that you could put out there. And one thing that they all have in common is that set of ambitious ideas and dreams and vision that they have, and the ambition and the drive to make that happen. So how did Washington demonstrate ambition? He demonstrated ambition by building a network. You know, very early on, he was very aware that his family wasn't rich. And he quickly made, you know, and it sounds worse than it is, but he made alliances and he built up his network, especially with the Fairfaxes. It's called out in the book that the Fairfaxes, you know, really were the movers and shakers and the top dogs, so to speak, of Virginia society. And they were very influential back in England as well as the rest of the colonies. And being close and being neighborly with them certainly helped him out. But he also took advantage to volunteer his services, do what he could to help Lord Fairfax and be a faithful and good servant, and always looking to serve those people within that network and that growing network. The early entrepreneurship, when he went out and taught himself mathematics and then taught himself surveying and became the surveyor for the county where he was at, he essentially at the age of 16 or so was making what a lawyer would make in that same county. And he was taking that and building up both his network and his monies. He volunteered to do the hard jobs. He took that assignment and he volunteered to go out and tell the French that it was time for them to leave the Ohio Valley area. And essentially he took the message to them that French could leave or Britain and France would go to war. And he did this in the closing months of winter. He faced an attack by an Indian who, betrayed them, tried to assassinate them. He and the other gentleman that went with him, they crossed a river in freezing conditions. And trust me, as a kayaker who has a wetsuit and who has the gear on, even when I get in cold water during wintertime, it's still a shock to the system. Washington didn't have that. They had cotton clothes. They put a makeshift raft together, and as soon as they pushed off, the raft falls apart, and basically they have to swim across the river in freezing conditions, and could have died of exposure, could have died a couple of different ways on that mission. But Washington would take those hard jobs, and he did that because he knew that would give him skills that would show the ambition that he had, and he would be rewarded for it. He knew that if he made the difficult decisions and if he took the difficult assignments, that he would be rewarded for doing all of that. So that was very important to him. And he always had an eye on increasing his situation. Whenever it was possible, when he finally started to have some funds and neighbors would run into debt, he would make loans with the idea that he would be the first one that could buy some of their land if they couldn't repay the loans. And it may seem a little bit aggressive, or it may seem a little bit hard to us at this time, but that was a very common practice at that time. So he kept enough currency and he kept enough wealth around him that he was able to take advantage when other people had slips and could increase his land holdings through others' mistakes. So what lessons in this presentation have really struck a chord with you? What did you learn, and what did you see that maybe you weren't aware of before? Not necessarily about George Washington, although I hope you learned something a little bit more than what you might have learned in your 6th grade history class. But I'm hoping that you learned something a little bit deeper about leadership, something a little bit more about what you can apply in your life, in your business, in your network. And where do you see these lessons in practice today? Is there anybody around you right now where you can go and you can see like, oh, this person is very, very honest, and I can see how that's paying off, and then what areas can you improve on? And, I don't want anybody to answer this out loud, but what areas are you maybe a little shaky on, or what areas do you think you could definitely take that step forward and improve with? And where do you see your strengths? We've covered 3 chapters tonight, but where do you see your strengths? Do you see that if somebody was to do a 360 evaluation on you, that they would go, this person's very honest, or this person really has great vision. They're really able to cast a vision and clearly communicate that with the group so that they can move that group forward towards that end. Where do you think you're going to be able to make the most impact with people? If somebody was writing a book about you, what leadership strengths, what leadership lessons would they take away from you? And it's just something to think about. So we've reached the end of the presentation. And so for next week, we're going to copy and talk about a leader is courageous, a leader has self-control, and a leader takes personal responsibility, and a leader is determined. And I hope that you all learn a little bit more and will join me next week when we continue this discussion. Thank you very much and have a good evening.